peoples, the destruction of cultural heritage, the destruction of cultural artifacts, religious heritage, this kind of things, ethnic cleansing, all of these kinds of scenarios that we've seen over, certainly over the last century, this century too. And some of the description of actions that constitute cultural genocide in this UN document that I was looking at did seem to me to bear some striking resemblances to what is happening to lesbians. So I kind of started to think about what's happening to us in that context, in that light. And I thought, people are going to think this is all a bit hyperbolic, using the term genocide. I'm thinking particularly about cultural genocide, destruction of language, destruction of heritage, resources, these kinds of things. And I have to say, after last week, I don't think it's hyperbolic at all to be thinking of it in this way. I think this is what we're looking at, and one of the things that is most terrifying and most dismaying about it is that there's a group of people outside, probably a lot of young people, maybe some of them actually are lesbians in that group outside, because unfortunately some of the greatest cheerleaders and the greatest defenders of transgenderism and all of the harms that this is doing to young lesbians, well, to all lesbians, but particularly to young lesbians, are other lesbians themselves. And we see this amongst lesbians in very prominent and influential positions, the likes of Ruth Hunt, Linda Riley in this country, others in other countries. So I'm not so sure, maybe there are people here with a much better, it wouldn't be hard to have a much better knowledge of history than I've got, much better knowledge of history of conflict, and political history. But I'm really hard pushed to think of the destruction of a group of people that has ever been so championed by even those among that people itself. It's absolutely desperate, and certainly the reception that we got when we did the Get the L Out action at London Pride last year, and some of the reaction that Posey, Venice and I got from our efforts a week or so back, I think it's really, it's something that it's really quite hard for me to get my head around anyway, quite how this has been championed by those who you would usually assume to be on your side. So anyway, so I really haven't got very long. I'm kind of the warm-up for the main speakers. So I just want to go through these definitions of actions that constitute cultural genocide in the eyes of the United Nations, and just have a very brief think of, and I'm sure you can think of examples of what we're seeing happening to lesbians, and particularly perhaps to young lesbians at the moment. So there are 5. So the first one is any action which has the aim or effect of depriving a group of their integrity as distinct peoples, or of their cultural values or ethnic identities. Obviously this was written in terms of geographically identifiable peoples or peoples of particular ethnic identities. But if we think of lesbians here, we can think of a simple definition, much in the way that this simple definition works, I think, in a very logical and straightforward way to explain what a woman is. We can think of a lesbian as a woman who is sexually attracted to, who loves other women, or maybe if you prefer, I don't really like this term homosexual, but if you prefer that kind of language, lesbian is a female homosexual. The definition of lesbian is absolutely dependent on the definition of woman, because it's about women who are attracted to and form relationships and sexual relationships and love other women. This is a very thing that is being denied to us. So our integrity as having a right to define ourselves, to define our very language, to define our space, to define who we are, is something that is now being considered hate speech, and something that, in the words of even one of the organisers of Pride in London, something that has to be stamped out because we're hateful, transphobic, TERFs, all the rest of it, if we assert this definition. So I think that's a fairly straightforward example of the war on lesbians and any kind of possibility of defining ourselves and maintaining our integrity as a distinct group. The second part of the definition is any action which has the aim or effect of dispossessing groups of their lands, territories or resources. So again, we can see how it's been used in different contexts than the one I'm using it. And if we think about lesbians, I mean, the history of, lesbian existence, lesbian lives, we probably don't have that much in the way of lands and resources anyway. Certainly there have been women's lands, which have been, or even indeed lesbian lands, but, really quite minuscule sort of enterprises. What existed of those have all but been wiped away in places like America and in Europe. There are some really wonderful examples that have been maintained. But if we think about the fertile soil in which lesbians can thrive, that is lesbian-only space and women-only space, and that is where we can see how that is absolutely not being tolerated. That's been sabotaged, and there are many, many examples that we can think of that where. Even to have a simple meeting like this one, which isn't particularly about the wider lesbian culture, but even to have a simple meeting like this one, usually there's attempts to sabotage venues, there's even been, physical assault, these kinds of things. Academic called Bonnie Morris wrote a really wonderful book, I think it came out maybe a couple of years ago now, called The Disappearing L Word, and she charts the loss of the kinds of spaces that we would have had created from the 1970s, 80s, in the kind of heyday of lesbian feminism, and we can see that that's really there's been a drastic, I can't even say the word decline, I would say probably really decimation of those spaces. And if any of you saw the work that was done by Michael Biggs, a sociologist at Oxford University, a few months ago, he did an analysis of the number of mentions of the words lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender in the annual reports of a number of so-called LGBT organisations such as Stonewall, Human Rights Campaign in America, GLAAD in America, I think. And you can see there the way that the L, which was never particularly sizable in those annual reports, has just completely declined, and the way that the T has gone up. I really think that's a very striking and important piece of work. And similarly then, he also looked at funding for LGBT organisations, and again we see the complete lack of resources. Really, I don't think there are any resources, the lack of resources anyway, for distinctly lesbian groups that do not include men or young boys sometimes who also claim to be lesbians. But I think just to dwell on that point, however many minutes I've got, 2 minutes? It's 10, okay, I've got up to 50, okay. But I think probably the main thing that I want to say under this idea of dispossession of our lands, territories and resources, if a lesbian is first and foremost a woman, then what our main resource and our land is, the land that we inhabit, is our body. And what we're seeing happen to the bodies of young lesbians is absolutely... I'm constantly sort of reaching for words. I mean, to say scandalous, I think is putting it far too mildly. It's absolutely horrifying, and I really encourage you to watch the video of the event that was held very controversially, as it could have been, was predicted, at the Heritage Foundation. When we were in America, there was a member of WOLF, Jennifer Chavez, who read the testimonies of parents and mothers in particular about what was happening to their young lesbian daughters who now believe they're men, and the testimonies around the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and in particular, it was so shocking to me, I think I've managed to just blank most of it from my mind because I couldn't really take it in, but the prevalence now of double mastectomies in often very young girls, that in America, with parental consent, a young girl of 13 could have a double mastectomy, and certainly, ages 15, 16. So there was one nurse actually who spoke to spoke to Rosie. She worked in a hospital in Marin County. I'm not even sure entirely sure where that is in the States. And she said that at that hospital they were performing between 4 and 6 mastectomies every day on the bodies of young women who are the overwhelming majority of whom will be lesbians. And that's even before we get into the stripping of flesh and skin from forearms and thighs and the construction of this kind of appendage, which is, you know, a fairly kind of useless thing, and I can't imagine a much more damaging and alienating process from your body. So when we're talking about dispossession from our territories and lands, I think we have to look at the destruction of lesbian bodies as the primary example of that. Okay, I'm going to go through these last ones very quickly. The last three are population transfer, which is usually used to refer to forced migration or forced displacement of people. But here, what do we see with the transgender movement? A population of young lesbians who believe that it is so ugly and grim and kind of socially ostracizing to be a lesbian. It's far more attractive and exciting and kind of lauded to be a trans man. So we're seeing this population transfer of young lesbians basically into a kind of a pseudo-heterosexual relationship. And at the same time, we're seeing this forced invasion of lesbian spaces by adult men who claim to be lesbians, and all the rape culture and violation that goes along with that. The last two then, assimilation or integration, forced assimilation or integration of the abused group by other cultures, imposed through legislative, administrative or other means. So we can see, for example, the Equality Act, which is being proposed in the States at the moment, which will function in many ways like the sort of Gender Recognition Act reforms that they want to try and push through here, that will outlaw what they are calling conversion therapy. So if a young child presents and says that, oh, if a young girl says, I'm a boy and I want you to call me, you know, boy's name and boy pronouns, and then, you know, access puberty blockers, anything that in any way puts the brakes on that will be seen as an attempt at conversion therapy and will be outlawed. So any kind of room for creating a space to question this narrative around transgenderism, and then the pathway, which will, you know, can end up with the double mastectomy and the fake penis, will be any kind of break on that will be outlawed. And finally, and again, I've got lots of examples of this ringing in my ears, any action, any form of propaganda that is directed against the victimised group is a form of cultural genocide. And so we see propaganda such as articles published, how to have lesbian sex with a trans woman. We're told that being lesbian is transphobic. Those of us who are active in this have seen plenty of examples of things like, you know, tweets saying, suck on my girl dick, you know, all of this kind of thing. And as I say, those of us who've been active and involved in London Pride, it was said that we had to be stamped out, or I think at Manchester Pride, someone said we should have been dragged away by our saggy tits, was what this gay man had said. So but there's an avalanche of propaganda against us, a very mild form we've seen outside here this evening. But thank you so much. I hope I've managed to convey certainly what I fear about all of this, and what I hope that you will all be very galvanised to be more active about. Thank you so much.